drowning in the darkness.
Before we begin this chilling story, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon and let me know in the comments what you liked about the story.
I sit in my room now, barely able to breathe. Every movement makes the bed creak and my bones groan, a reminder that I'm not long for this world. The doctors come and go, offering me sympathetic glances, but none understand what truly matters. They have no idea what I've been through. Hell, if they knew, they'd think I was insane. But I can't die without telling this story. Someone has to know the truth. Hans, Erik and I uncovered something that should have stayed buried. We weren't searching for it, not at first. But the sea, that damn sea, called to us, and when we found it, we were never the same again. This isn't some ghost story or a tale of magic. No, this is far worse. This is real. It's about the deep, dark ocean and the things lurking beneath its surface, creatures no man was ever meant to witness. Let me begin with Hans. Like his father and his father before him, Hans was a fisherman, a born leader, someone you could trust with your life. And in our line of work, that trust was everything. He lived on a remote island off the rugged coast of Norway. The village, clinging to the cliffs, was isolated, surrounded by the icy black waters of the Norwegian Sea. The people there depended on the ocean for survival, and Hans was the best among them. Hans commanded a crew of 5, Lars, Henrik, Jürgen, Marcus and himself. They were the pride of the village. These weren't just ordinary fishermen, they were known as the golden hands of the island. If a storm hit and you needed a rescue, Hans and his men went out. If the fish were scarce, Hans knew where to find them. They had survived countless storms, rough seas and risky rescues. Nothing rattled them. Nothing. Until that day. It was a cold autumn morning when Hans and his crew prepared for what should have been a routine day of fishing. The wind howled through the harbor, harsher than usual, but not enough to stop them. Hans was experienced. He wouldn't risk his crew if the weather was too dangerous. But despite the biting chill in the air that morning, something felt off. The sea had always been unpredictable, but this was different. The air was tense, and the radio had been crackling with static since dawn. The sonar showed strange disturbances far out in the ocean. But Hans, ever practical, didn't dwell on it. They had faced lousy weather before and always made it back home. "Feels like the ocean's angry today," Hans muttered to Lars, the first mate, as they prepared the nets. Lars chuckled, slapping him on the back. "She's always angry, boss. Nothing new there." Hans smiled, but the unease didn't leave him. "Still, keep an eye on the instruments." As they set out, the crew did what they always did, worked hard and kept the mood light. Jürgen, the youngest, cracked jokes as they cast the nets, his laughter rising above the wind. Henrik, the quiet giant of the group, hummed a low tune while hauling gear. Even Marcus, always the most serious, seemed more relaxed than usual. The sea was their livelihood and playground, and they knew how to respect it. But that respect was about to be tested. The morning passed uneventfully, aside from the wind picking up. They joked, worked, and talked about heading back early if the weather worsened. But as the hours wore on, Hans's unease grew. He couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. The waves were getting taller and more erratic, and the sky had turned an ominous shade of grey. Then it happened, a flash of light beneath the ocean surface, far off but unmistakable. At first, they thought it was just the reflection of the sun, maybe lightning from an approaching storm. But it wasn't. The light came from deep below, growing brighter as if something immense was moving beneath the surface. "Hans, you see that?" Lars called from the back of the boat, his voice tight with concern. Hans nodded, his jaw clenched. "Everyone, hold on! Something's not right." The light pulsed again, and this time they felt it. A deep vibration resonated through the hull of the boat. The water around them began to swirl unnaturally, and the strong wind became even more violent. Then the explosion hit. It wasn't like anything they'd ever experienced. A blast, not from the sky, but from the ocean's depths. The boat was tossed like a toy, and the crew was thrown to the deck, struggling to hold on as waves slammed into them. The water, once a familiar friend, was now black, foaming and full of debris. And blood. But it wasn't human blood. And it wasn't from fish. It was something else, thicker, darker, with a foul stench that clung to their skin and made their stomachs churn. "Holy shit, what is this?" Jürgen screamed, wiping the thick red liquid from his face. Hans didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the horizon, where the light had come from. Another pulse, another explosion, and then the worst of it, the waves. The boat was thrown into chaos. A massive wave rose from the black water, towering over them. It crashed with terrifying force, smashing into the side of the boat and sending Henrik overboard. He didn't even have time to scream. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the churning sea. "Henrik!" Lars screamed, reaching over the side, but there was nothing to grab onto. Another wave hit, slamming the boat against a jagged outcrop of rocks. The hull cracked, and the crew was thrown like ragdolls. Jürgen hit the deck hard, his body limping as the waves dragged him toward the rocky shore. Hans, somehow, stayed at the helm, but he was losing control fast. The storm was relentless, the sea roaring with fury, and the flashes beneath the surface grew more frequent, each followed by another explosion. The final wave came with a sickening crash, and the boat split in two, the pieces scattered across the water like driftwood. Lars and Marcus were killed instantly, their bodies smashed against the rocks. Hans, thrown clear by some miracle, drifted in and out of consciousness, his life vest barely keeping him afloat as the storm raged on. When Hans finally woke, he was in a small camp along the shore. His body ached, bruised and battered, but alive. He didn't know how he had survived. The boat was gone, his crew was dead, and the village was in ruins. Later, he learned a massive earthquake hit the island while they were at sea. Homes collapsed, livestock was lost, and many villagers were injured. The military had arrived, along with local authorities, assessing the damage and helping the wounded. But Hans knew better. That wasn't just an earthquake. What he had seen, those explosions, that light, there was something more going on, something the authorities weren't talking about, and Hans kept his mouth shut when they started questioning him about what had happened at sea. He didn't trust them. The military presence made him even more suspicious. They weren't there to help. They were there to cover something up. Hans couldn't shake the feeling that the government, the military, or someone in power knew what had happened, and whatever it was, they wanted to keep it quiet. Hans became more withdrawn after that. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, were dull, as if something vital had been stripped away. He spent his days quietly in the village, refusing to speak about the disaster at sea. His silence only fueled the growing rumors among the villagers. Some thought the earthquake had traumatized him, but others whispered about strange lights, the storm, and the sea's unexplained rage. I came into the story years later. I was working as a marine biologist at the time, fascinated by the ocean's mysteries. My research took me to some of the world's most remote and dangerous waters, and my curiosity often led me down paths others feared to tread. I had always felt drawn to the unknown, especially the deep, dark places no one dared to explore. I first heard of Hans during one of my deep dives into obscure scientific reports and sonar data. His story wasn't in any official record. I stumbled upon it in a hidden corner of the internet, where whispers of conspiracy and the supernatural mixed with legitimate scientific discovery. There was a small online forum filled with fragments of the tale. Hans wasn't like the others posting wild theories and outlandish stories. His account was detailed, almost too specific, and the fear behind his words felt real. He spoke of the explosion, the black water, and his crew, all of whom had perished that day. Something about his words made me believe him, more than I believed any other half-baked theory I had come across. I couldn't let it go. I reached out to Hans, and after several weeks of silence, he responded. His message was brief, but he agreed to meet. Something about the desperation in his voice haunted me. This wasn't just another crackpot seeking attention. Hans had experienced something terrifying, and I needed to know what it was. The first time I met Hans, he sat at the edge of a craggy cliff, staring at the endless expanse of the Norwegian Sea. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but there was a spark of recognition when he saw me approach. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what happened at sea in years, but something in him had shifted, and now he was ready to tell the whole story. He began slowly, recounting the events with a hoarse voice. As he spoke, his eyes kept darting to the horizon, as if expecting something monstrous to rise from the depths at any moment. "What we saw that day," he said, trembling slightly, "wasn't from this world. I've spent years convincing myself it was just a freak accident, an earthquake or a storm, but I know better. That light came from something alive, deep beneath the ocean, and when it rose, everything changed. The sea became angry." The more he spoke, the more I realized this was no ordinary tale of misfortune at sea. Hans's story echoed something ancient, something primal that I had come across in my research. Stories of sea monsters, of creatures that sailors had whispered about for centuries. But Hans's story wasn't a legend, it was real. As we talked, Hans revealed that the military had become heavily involved after the wreck. They'd questioned him relentlessly, but he had refused to tell them everything. They seemed too eager to sweep the whole thing under the rug. He suspected that they knew far more than they were letting on. His village had been left in ruins, but the military presence felt less like a rescue operation and more like a cover-up. "Why didn't you speak up?" I asked. Hans let out a bitter laugh. What would they have done? Called me crazy, locked me away. They didn't want the truth, and neither did the authorities. Whatever's down there, they don't want the world to know. His words chilled me, but they also fueled my obsession. There was something in his story, something that connected to strange sonar readings and unexplained events that had been happening across the Atlantic. I began sharing my findings with Hans, and slowly, piece by piece, we started to uncover the truth. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon Erik. He had been following our online conversations for weeks, though we hadn't known it. Erik, a former naval officer, had seen too much during his time at sea. His message was cryptic but clear when he finally reached out. "I know what happened. I was there." Hans was skeptical, but I convinced him to meet Erik in person. We arranged a rendezvous at a remote cabin along the coast. The place was isolated, far from prying eyes, and cold. Erik arrived, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face and an air of quiet authority. He wasted no time in getting to the point. We weren't the first ones to engage the creature. Erik began, his voice tense as he recalled the nightmare. It had been moving north for days, too fast, too erratic for anyone to get a good look at it. The navies of Argentina and Brazil tried to slow it down near their coasts. They threw everything they had at it: depth charges, torpedoes, missiles, but nothing worked. By the time it reached the Canary Islands, NATO had deployed everything to stop it. We had battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, an entire fleet, and we still couldn't contain it. Hans and I exchanged uneasy glances as Erik spoke. The weight of his words pressed on us like the ocean's depth. "They fired everything," Erik continued, his eyes distant as if reliving those moments. "Cruise missiles, torpedoes, you name it. We were tracking the creature on the radar. The screen lit up with every strike, each missile hitting its target. But it kept moving, relentless, like nothing could slow it down." "What did it look like?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Erik paused, his fists clenched as he searched for the right words. "It was a monster," he said finally. "An eel the size of a skyscraper, with a head like something out of a nightmare. It had these black, unblinking eyes, and armor, thick, scaly, almost impenetrable armor that covered its body like a shield." He shook his head as if trying to rid himself of the image. "We knew we were the last line of defense. We were stationed in the depths of the Norwegian Sea, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the order to fire." His eyes darkened as he continued. "We were ordered to intercept the creature before it reached the coast. The stakes were high. It could destroy everything in its path if it reached the mainland." The room was silent as Erik's words hung in the air, the tension building with each sentence. "When the radar showed it approaching, our captain didn't hesitate. We launched the first salvo, 5 missiles aimed directly at the creature's head. We watched as they closed in, one after the other. The first missile missed entirely, detonating harmlessly in the water. The second and third missiles hit, but they barely scratched the surface, glancing off its thick armor like pebbles. The fourth missile found its mark, slamming straight into what we thought was its eye. The creature slowed momentarily, just long enough for us to think we'd done it." Hans leaned forward, his face pale. "But it didn't stop, did it?" Erik shook his head, his voice grim. "No, it came back, faster, angrier. That's when the order came, fire the nuke." The air in the room grew heavier as Erik described the moment. "Our captain didn't hesitate. We had the key for the nuclear torpedoes, and we knew what that meant. There was no turning back. We fire and hope it works, or let that thing reach the coast." The launch was swift. The alarms blared, the red lights flashed, and the torpedo shot out with a loud thud. We dove as deep as possible, trying to get as far away from the blast radius as possible. Erik's hands trembled as he spoke. The first missile hit again, cracking the creature's armor. Then the nuke followed, detonating right inside its skull. The explosion. I've never felt anything like it. The shockwave tore through the water, rattling every bolt and seam in our sub. We were thrown around like rag dolls. For a moment we thought it was over. Erik paused, taking a breath, the memory clearly painful. But then the sonar picked it up again. The creature was still moving, still alive. We thought we had killed it, but it wasn't dead. The order came through again. Destroy the body. Erase all evidence. Hans leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. You fired another nuke? Erik nodded. Yes. This time we didn't just fire it at the creature. We targeted the entire area. When it detonated, there wasn't just an explosion. There was nothing left. No creature, no debris, nothing. The sea was calm again, like nothing had ever been there. There was only silence for a moment, the weight of Erik's words sinking in. The island, Erik said quietly, his gaze flicking to Hans. the one where your village is. It's not just an ordinary place. We've known for years that something unnatural lies beneath it. There's some gravitational anomaly. Whenever we try to investigate, it's like we're pushed back. Whatever that creature was, it came from there, and it's not the only one. The room fell into a heavy silence as Erik finished. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on all of us. Hans stared out the window, his hands shaking slightly. Erik looked exhausted, as if recounting the story had drained the life out of him. After hearing Erik's story, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. All I could think about was the creature, the thing they'd killed in the sea, and what might still be down there, waiting. My rational part knew it was madness to even think about going after it. But the part of me that craved answers, the part that had led me to study the ocean in the first place, wouldn't let it go. I need to know more, I said finally. I need to see it for myself. Hans snapped his head toward me, his face tight with anger. Are you mad? You'll get yourself killed, just like my crew. I can't just let this go, I said. Whatever's down there, I need to understand it. You know I'm not going to stop. For a long moment, Hans said nothing, his jaw clenched. Then, with a heavy sigh, he relented. Fine, but if you go alone. And so, I prepared for the dive. The following day, before dawn, I hired a local sailor to take me out into the waters near the island. Most refused, claiming the area was cursed, but money speaks, and eventually I found someone willing to take the risk. The sea was calm as we set out, the sky still dark, but I could feel the weight of what was waiting below. As I suited up, readying my gear, the sailor, a grizzled man in his 50s, looked at me with pity and disbelief. If you go down there and don't come back, I'm not waiting around for you, he warned. I'll leave you for the sea. Thanks for the encouragement, I muttered, adjusting my mask. Then, with a deep breath, I dove into the black water, descending into the unknown. The cold hit me like a wall as I plunged beneath the surface, the shock of the frigid water stealing the air from my lungs. I forced myself to breathe slowly, focusing on the rhythm of my descent. My headlamp cut through the dark water, but only just. The ocean was vast and empty, a black abyss stretching endlessly in all directions. This kind of darkness could make a person feel truly insignificant. I descended deeper, the pressure building around me, squeezing my chest and ears. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional crackle of my radio and the steady hum of my breathing apparatus. As I descended further, I began to feel something else, something strange, almost like the water itself was resisting my progress. It was a subtle pushback, like the ocean didn't want me to go any deeper. But I pressed on. I had come too far to turn back now. The radar readings we'd analyzed in preparation for the dive showed something unusual. Anomalous energy signatures, deep fissures in the seabed, and strange, unexplained movements beneath the water. Hans had described the light, the explosion, the waves. I had to see it for myself. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the seafloor. The darkness down here was oppressive, suffocating. My light barely penetrated the gloom, casting shadows across the barren, rocky landscape. The ocean floor was desolate, a vast expanse of nothingness, interrupted only by the occasional jagged outcrop or strange, twisted rock formation. It was as though something had torn through here, ripping the seabed apart. As I drifted forward, scanning the area, my heart began to race. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. The water was too still, too silent. It felt unnatural. Then I saw it, a faint glow just at the edge of my vision. It was the same light Hans had described, the same light that had haunted his nightmares for years. I swam toward it, the glow growing brighter with every stroke. And then, out of the darkness it appeared, two massive red eyes. They glowed with an eerie light, cutting through the blackness like twin beacons. My heart pounded as I stared into them, frozen by their gaze. The eyes were vast, larger than any creature I had ever seen or even imagined. They stared at me as if they were studying me, judging me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed by fear, by awe, by the sheer magnitude of the creature in front of me. This was no myth, no legend. This was real. The Kraken. The creature was enormous, its body full of thick, leathery skin and powerful, coiling tentacles. It was far larger than anything I could have prepared for. It moved with an otherworldly grace, its massive form cutting through the water effortlessly despite its size. It was like watching a mountain glide through the ocean. My mind struggled to comprehend its sheer scale. It watched me for an eternity, its glowing eyes unblinking. Then, without warning, it moved. A massive tentacle shot toward me, and I was thrown backward by the force of its movement. I tumbled through the water, my equipment rattling as I struggled to regain control. The Kraken wasn't attacking me. It didn't need to. It was merely toying with me, reminding me of just how insignificant I was in the grand scheme of things. I tried to get a grip on myself to stabilize my breathing, but the fear was too overwhelming. This creature, this thing, wasn't just some animal. It was ancient, primal, something far beyond human understanding. It was the kind of creature that had inspired the legends of the Kraken, the Leviathan, the sea monsters of old. I had to get out of there. I turned and swam as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. The water around me seemed to warp and twist, as if the Kraken's very presence was distorting reality itself. Every stroke felt heavier, every inch of distance a struggle. It was as if the ocean was trying to hold me back, drag me into its depths, and keep me from escaping. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Kraken vanished. The water was still again, the eerie glow of its eyes fading into the blackness. I kept swimming, pushing myself to the limits of my strength, desperate to reach the surface. When I finally broke through the water, gasping for air, the sailor was there, wide-eyed and pale. He pulled me aboard, his hands trembling. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice shaky. I couldn't find the words. I sat there, drenched and shivering, the weight of what I had just experienced crashing down on me. The creature, its eyes, size, power, was too much to process. We returned to shore in silence. The sailor didn't speak again, and I couldn't. My mind was too clouded with images of the Kraken, of those red eyes staring into my soul. When I got back to the village, I collapsed from exhaustion. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital room. The doctors said I had been out for days, suffering from shock and severe dehydration. But none of that mattered. All I could think about was the Kraken. For weeks I was haunted by the sheer magnitude of what I had witnessed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes burning through the darkness, watching me. I needed to tell someone. The world had to know what was lurking in the ocean's depths. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. So I wrote down everything. The dive, the Kraken, the terror. I uploaded my story online, just as I had done with Hans's tale. But the moment I hit send, my computer screen went black. Before I could react, I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The door to my apartment burst open, and men in black suits stormed in, their faces hidden behind masks. I barely had time to stand before they grabbed me, dragging me away from my desk. They didn't say a word as they destroyed my computer, my notes, everything. They left nothing behind. A dark cloth was thrown over my head, and the world went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I finally came, I was in a small, dimly lit room, my hands bound to a chair. A large man stood before me, his expression cold and calculating. He said nothing as he began to beat me, each blow sending waves of pain through my body. I tried to scream, but the cloth around my face muffled the sound. After what felt like an eternity, the man stopped. He stepped back, and a woman entered the room. She was calm, almost serene, as she handed me a glass of water and removed the cloth from my face. "Tell me everything," she said softly, sitting across from me. For days they interrogated me, alternating between the man's brutality and the woman's soft-spoken questions. They asked me about my life, research, everything, except the Kraken. Whenever I tried to bring it up, they would ignore me as if it didn't exist. It was clear they knew. They didn't want me talking about it. Time lost all meaning. I was trapped in a dark nightmare, and the memories of my life outside began to fade. The only constant was the fear that I would never escape this hell. After what felt like a lifetime, they finally released me. I was brought to a small house in a quiet town, far away from the horrors I had endured. Although I was free, I felt like a ghost, haunted by the memories of my imprisonment. At first, I was being watched closely, but slowly, the agents faded into the background. I learned that the government had long known about the Kraken and had hidden it from the world. My life had been a carefully constructed lie, and the truth was more terrifying than I could have imagined. When I returned to my home in the old town, I found it had been rebuilt. My childhood home was gone, replaced by a new house. I learned that they had burned my home down and faked my death. My friends and family believed I had perished in a tragic fire, unaware of my suffering. Now, lying on my deathbed, I reflect on the years lost in darkness. Erik passed away 2 months ago, and I discovered that Hans was in a road accident on the same day I was arrested. His arms were amputated, and he can no longer walk or speak. I'm certain I know who orchestrated this accident. The weight of it all is crushing. I know my time is running out, and I need the world to hear my story. I want them to understand the truth about the Kraken, a creature beyond myth. As I take my final breaths, I only hope someone will listen, that the truth will rise from the depths and be revealed. I close my eyes, haunted by the red eyes I've seen for so long. The Kraken is real, and it deserves to be known. With that final thought, I let go, ready to face whatever lies beyond.